This is the second part of our neuroscience lecture. So we're going to focus this lecture on the central nervous system, which, if you recall from the first portion, includes the brain and the spinal cord. Mostly we're going to be looking at the brain. I like to start talking about the brain by thinking about this quote. If a human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. So I just want to use this to help us understand that the brain is extraordinary. The human brain has the capability to do numerous things, and there's much about it that we do not know how it works. So if you imagine that a cup of water is everything that is true of the human brain, we know maybe 2 or 3 drops worth of how it works. So there's a lot of things that are still beyond us when it comes to the human brain. But this is what we do know. And the way that we know what we know comes from imaging techniques, the ability to look at the brain in different ways. So there's 2 major imaging techniques I want to point to before we talk about the structures of the brain. The first is the MRI, or the magnetic resonance imaging. And maybe you've had an MRI, whether on your brain or your back or your lungs or some other part of your body. Basically what happens here is that it uses radio and magnetic waves to look at the structure of the brain. So this would give a person a look into what the brain actually looks like. It doesn't tell us how it works, it just tells us what it looks like. This was a major advance because now we don't have to cut people open to be able to look inside of their brains. The fMRI, or the functional magnetic resonance imaging, measures function, and it does this by tracking blood and oxygen flow. So the idea is that the parts of your brain that you're using are using the most blood and oxygen. So if we can take a picture of where the most blood and oxygen is, we know which part of the brain is working at what time. So this is an example. Like I mentioned before, places that are highlighted are the places where there's the most activation. So there are 5 major areas of the brain, 5 major parts, and this is listed from the oldest part of the brain evolutionarily to the newest part of the brain. So we'll start with the brainstem. The brainstem is at the very center base of your brain and is made up of a couple different parts, but its major job is to keep you alive. So the first part is the medulla, and the medulla is what controls your heartbeat and your automatic breathing. So the reason that you don't have to think to yourself, breathe, breathe, breathe every few seconds is because the medulla is doing it for you. So if you were to get damage to this part of the brain, you wouldn't be able to keep your body alive because your heart wouldn't beat and you wouldn't breathe. The reticular formation is just above that, and it's the brain's gatekeeper. It basically decides what does or does not get into the brain. So you might be thinking, what? Some stuff doesn't get into the brain? And the answer is yes. Actually, a huge amount of stuff doesn't make it into the brain. There's a lot of information coming in through your senses all the time that the brain does not deem important. So it keeps it from making it into the brain. So for example, you probably aren't thinking about how the seat feels against your butt until I said it. But that would be information your brain had been scanning out. The thalamus is at the very top of the brain stem, and it's the brain's switchboard. Basically what happens is the information comes in through the body, the reticular formation decides what comes in and out, and if it does get in, then the thalamus sends that signal to the appropriate part of the brain, because each brain part has a specific job. Then we come to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is in the back base of your brain. So on the left we're looking at the brain from underneath, and on the right is a side vision. And cerebellum technically means little brain, and it's because it looks a little bit like a little brain. But this helps you do a few things. It helps you first judge time. So you might not know exactly how long this lecture has been lasting, but you could probably choose between minutes versus hours. It's only been going on for minutes, and the reason you know that it hasn't been hours is that you have a sense of time, and that's in your cerebellum. This also helps with your subconscious memory, so you probably don't have to remember how to tie your shoe anymore. It's a subconscious memory. That would be in your cerebellum. And then it helps with your movement and your balance. The limbic system is next, and the limbic system is made up of a few parts. It's this area highlighted in red that looks kind of like aliens wrapped around other parts of the brain. And the 3 parts I want to focus on are the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. The hippocampus is involved in conscious memory formation. So this is stuff you have to try to remember on purpose. So for example, when you later are trying to remember what's the function of the hippocampus, you'll actually be using the hippocampus in trying to make that memory. The amygdala is the part that influences our ability to be aggressive or to be afraid. And then the hypothalamus is a tiny little part of the brain, but it actually might be one of the most powerful parts of the brain. This is what's called the reward center or the pleasure center. And it's involved in the 4 F's: fighting, feeding, fleeing, and fornicating. So these are the things to us that feel good, right? Sex feels good, eating feels good, and the reason it feels good is because these activate the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus, when stimulated, makes us feel good. It might not surprise you then to know that this is also the part of the brain that is involved in addiction. So people who are addicted to alcohol or a drug of some kind are getting stimulation from that drug or alcohol in their hypothalamus. This is so powerful that in a study where they put an electrode into a rat's brain so that the rat learned if it pushed a button, it could get a little stimulation in its hypothalamus. What the rat did is it just started pushing the button over and over and over and over and again constantly to the point where it didn't do anything else like eat or drink, and so they actually would die because the feeling was so good. And then the final major component is the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is the wrinkly part that covers the brain. So most of all the other structures we've talked about have been deep within inside the brain. The cerebral cortex is the coating, and it's often referred to as the brain CEO because it's kind of in charge of the higher order parts of the brain. This is the portions that are especially developed in humans. Lots of other mammals have similar amygdalas and similar cerebellums, but very few mammals have anything close to our cerebral cortex. So this is a part of our brain that actually makes up the majority of it, 85% of our brain's weight. There are 2 hemispheres. You've probably heard about the left brain and the right brain, and that is what we're referring to as the left cerebral cortex and the right cerebral cortex. And then there's many subparts. So let's talk a little bit about those. First, there's 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex. The first lobe is the frontal lobe, and you have a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe, and these are found directly behind your forehead. These are in charge of your judgment, your ability to plan, your ability to inhibit yourself. So we all probably think things that we don't say out loud, and the reason we don't say them out loud is we know that it wouldn't be acceptable, and our frontal lobe keeps us from doing that. This is where general personality resides, and then also our executive motor control, making decisions about when to move and when not to move. So this part of our brain is one of the last to develop. It doesn't finish until we're approximately 25. So that's one of the reasons why teenagers and young adults aren't that great at planning or making good decisions or inhibiting themselves. It's also the reason why marriages that start before the age of 25 are more likely to end in divorce than marriages that start after the age of 25. Because your personality is still developing, there's a good chance a person could change, which is what happens often when people grow apart, or maybe they didn't make a very good decision when they got married in the first place. So the frontal lobe is probably one of the most important parts. The parietal lobes are at the back top of our head, and these are involved in spatial reasoning, so our ability to understand directions, to know north from south, our sensory processing, which I'll talk about in a second, and then our physical sense of self. So maybe you haven't ever wondered this, but maybe you should wonder, why can I sit up straight in a chair without falling over? And that's because of the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe helps you have what's called proprioception, your ability to know when you're upright and hold yourself still upright so that you're not falling all over the place. So there's 2 subparts of the parietal lobe that I want to talk about. One is the motor cortex and one is a sensory cortex. And this is a strip about as wide as your finger on either side of your parietal lobe. The motor cortex portion is what's involved in making your different body parts move, and the sensory cortex is the part that feels stimulation in different body parts. So there actually are tiny parts on these parts of the brain that are associated with parts in your body. So you can see, for example, on the left, we have a motor cortex of the left hemisphere. And you'll see that there's a certain little part that's associated with the toes, and then the ankle, and then the knee, and then the hip, etc., etc. If I was to take a stimulator and put it into your brain at the part that was your left thumb on your motor cortex, it would actually cause your left thumb to start twitching. On the blue picture, we have the sensory cortex, and it's also associated with each body part. And if I was to stimulate the thumb part there, you would feel your thumb, even though nothing was touching it. Next, we have the temporal lobes, which are behind our ears on either side. So because they're by our ears, this is where we do our auditory processing, our hearing processing. This is also where a lot of our memories are stored, and speech processing. So when you are listening to my voice right now, your temporal lobes are active. In particular, your Broca and Wernicke's areas within the temporal lobes. These are your language centers. And for a vast majority of people, these are found on the left side, but not the right side. So the Wernicke's area is involved in interpreting audio stimuli. So when you're listening to either someone else talk or yourself talk, you're hearing it and making sense of it. That's your Wernicke's area. Your Broca's area is in charge of your actual putting together of speech. So when you decide to say something, your Broca's area puts that together for you. And then the final lobe is the occipital lobe, which is at the very back on either side, and this is involved in visual input. So data comes in through our eyeballs and goes directly straight back to our occipital lobes where it's processed. So then the last thing that I want to mention about the brain is something called the corpus callosum, and this is a band of tissue that connects the left hemisphere with the right hemisphere, and it allows information to pass between one hemisphere and the other, so that what happens on your left hemisphere can also be known about by your right hemisphere, and so vice versa. The reason this is important is because you maybe have heard before that the left brain controls the right side of your body and the right brain controls the left side of your body. So when you see something with your left eye, it's actually being processed by your right brain, and when you see something with your right eye, it's being processed by your left brain. Now the corpus callosum that's attaching the two allows that information to go back and forth between the two. So even though it's your left eye that's seeing something and your right brain processes it, your right brain then shares it with the left brain.